Schwierig an die Art Konsens war einige Sachen, aber also gerade das genauer sein Maßnahmen durchzuführen, genau ist und so weiter.
Ökonomie, das ist wieder ganz anderes. Da geht es alleine. Ich glaube, ja auch zu viel.
Das haben wir auch.
Einfacher, langfristig.
Wo hast du den so probiert? Deswegen
Sehen Sie die Präsentation?
Ja,
Dann geht der große Grüne weiter und der
rote ist zurück.
zurück.
Okay, das kriege ich hin. Tja, das ist schade. Hätte ich so gerne mal ausprobiert. Ja, super, Dankeschön.
Fang an.
Yeah, hello, back again after a very short coffee break here in Berlin, and very happy to have you all online or here in the room. We are now going, as mentioned already sometimes, to the next session, which is quite linked to the first one, talking about inequality. We're talking about the reasons, the roots also of populism, and we wanted to better understand what are the real drivers, and it's not to mention only the pure inequality of income and wealth, but it goes beyond. And Robert Gold has started to do a lot of huge research on this a couple of years ago, and for us also. And now he has prepared a paper on the economics of populism, and the idea was to try and have a first idea of what can help against populism, given that one of the main drivers seems to be economic, socio-economic, and so what can help against it. I will introduce the panel. We are all online already after the input, so I will ask Robert to introduce your thoughts on this question, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Thomas, for the kind introduction and the invitation. It really feels good to present in front of real people again. Yeah, my task has been to review the literature on the causes of populism again, to infer some policy implications. And if you look at this literature, you can roughly group the research into two categories. There's a lot of papers who deal with the what I would call very broadly cultural roots of populism. So norms, values, beliefs, identity that make people support populist agenda. And another strand of research is more concentrated on the economic roots. And while the literature on the cultural roots very nicely explains level differences. So why is it that populists are more successful in some countries than in others? And why is it that some regions support populists more than others? Why is it that regions in Germany that were already very supportive of the Nazi party are nowadays the same regions that support populist parties? Why is it that angry white men are so susceptible to populism? This is all very well explained by this set of literature. My understanding is that the literature that looks at the economic roots is better equipped to explain the recent rise of populism that we have seen over the last decade or so. And this is one reason why I want to focus on this set of literature, specifically also because it provides more opportunities for policy interventions, right? So if you want to address the cultural roots of populism, this would require societal change and a change in norms and beliefs. And it's not easy to really come up with concrete policy suggestions here. And you might even ask whether it is whether government should interfere with societal change in that way. But I think we can, from the literature on the economic roots, derive some more straightforward policy conclusions on what to do here. This does not mean that economic roots and cultural roots are independent of each other. They interrelate, specifically since the supply side, so the populist campaigning is very successful in linking these topics, in linking economic hardship to anxieties about the future, to xenophobia, and so on and so forth. My understanding here is that economic developments provide the ground for this populist agenda to succeed. And yeah, having said this is my view on the thing, and this is why I want to concentrate on the economic roots of populism. Let's have a quick look at the background. I want to focus on European countries. I want to focus on far-right populism, just because this is the dominant the dominant development in Europe. We see specifically a rise of far-right parties and right-wing populist parties, not so much on the left. And this map shows you results of the European parliamentary election in 1999, and the regional share of the regional vote shares populist parties gained there. You see this is before the eastward enlargement, and when we now click through it from European election to European election, you see how populist support spreads across the countries. You also see how the average increases, and if we look at just the change between the 2009 and 2019 elections, you see that populist parties have been active in all the countries. This was not the thing at the start, but populism spread across Europe. You have now populist parties on the ballots in each and every European country, and they have gained significant support, 2 percentage points on average, which is an increase of 100% over 10 years. But you also see these strong regional heterogeneities. You see country level heterogeneities, which may relate to cultural issues. And yeah, you don't see this that nicely on this map, I have to agree, but you also see huge regional variation within countries. So even countries like Germany, where populist support may be comparatively low as compared to, for instance, France or Austria, you still see that there are regional strongholds of populism that emerged, and I want to come back to that. But this is the background, this is the development we want to better understand. We want to understand what drives this development, not so much the level differences, but the dynamics over time. And here I tried to quickly and roughly summarize the literature results. So the broad picture is somewhat trivial, perhaps, that macroeconomic developments induce structural change in all countries. What we focus here on industrial countries, that increase inequalities, not only income inequalities, but inequalities in chances and the development perspectives. And this provides the voting potential for populist parties. Actually, it generates a voting potential for parties that offer protection against these macroeconomic shocks. It has to do a lot with the supply side, with the populist campaigning, that it's actually populist to tap into this potential. But and actually, many studies in economics do not clearly differentiate between far-right parties and extremist parties and populist parties, which has disadvantages, but in the very end, I think is reasonable, given that the economics behind and the dynamics behind is one that increases voting potential for a specific set of policies. In the end, the subset of the voting potential for extremist parties is a subset of this voting potential for populist parties. Having said this, yeah, this is the general trend. And what research has more closely looked into over the recent decade or so is specifically economic developments that relate to globalization and technological change. We have papers on financial globalization, very much focused on effects of the financial crisis, which is of course a little bit specific. We have papers on trade integration, very much focused on the rise of China. We have papers on technological change, very much focused on automation and digitalization. Sorry. And we have papers on international migration with a strong focus on the effect of the refugee crisis, which is of course also kind of specific. And of course, all these shocks interrelate. For trade globalization, you need to also have financial globalization to finance trade, and you need technological change to facilitate this. And in the trade affected regions, you then have investment into labor saving technology to cope with competition from low wage countries. I'll try to separate things where it's necessary. Otherwise, I'll treat this all more or less like big economic shocks. And these shocks induce structural change in industrialized countries. The big secular trends are deindustrialization and the growth of the service sector. You have automation that also puts pressure on specifically manufacturing jobs. And you have a trend, and this is specifically relevant if you look at regional inequalities of urbanization that relates to this. And sorry. In principle, this whole process of macroeconomic development and of structural change is an ever ongoing process. This has been there since the Industrial Revolution, but which is a little bit different perhaps, since the recent wave of globalization is not only that the dynamics accelerated, it is also that the inequalities that emerged became more polarized in many dimensions. So you have a decline of manufacturing in industrialized countries. On the other hand, you have a growth of service jobs, but those service jobs emerge not in the same regions where the manufacturing took place before. Those service jobs emerge in cities and contribute to this trend of urbanization. And to a certain degree, some of these inequalities that result from structural change reinforce and become increasingly difficult to bridge. The inequalities, obviously, because otherwise they would not be called inequalities, generate winners and losers. And there's increasing overlap. On the individual level, a lot depends on the skill level. So it's specifically medium and low skilled individuals that are negatively affected by deindustrialization and by automation. Similar on the regional level. There are former manufacturing regions that lose out due to trade integration and that lose out due to technological change, and that see in selective out-migration of skilled individuals to the urban centers, which further hampers the development perspectives of these regions. And this is more or less the basic picture of how economic shocks translate into the voting potential for far-right parties. The question is, does this provide opportunities for economic policy? And I want to focus on economic policy to tackle populism. Well, first and foremost, of course, welfare policies may help to cushion adverse impacts of economic shocks. This is true in general, but perhaps it's not too trivial to point out that welfare policies are not only a means to achieve distributional justice, but they also help to stabilize political systems by reducing those inequalities that lead to at least some people demanding more protectionist and less liberal policy agendas. And a good example is, I think, a paper by Glitch, which uses data and methodology by Colantuono and Stanek. Colantuono and Stanek have a paper where they show that increasing import competition increases support for right-wing populists in structurally declining regions in 15 European countries. And Glitch, very simple, decomposes this effect according to the welfare state generosity in different countries. And he shows that the effect is very much centered on countries with weak welfare states, very much in line with work by Roderick, and on countries that in principle have generous welfare state provisions, but cut down benefits, very much in line with the excellent work by Timo, who shows how welfare cuts contributed to the Brexit vote in the UK. So to summarize this, welfare state policies help and welfare institutions help to cushion this effect. But I think we have to accept that the challenge is not to just compensate losers for some income losses. Those people who are affected lose much more than just income. They lose development perspectives. You cannot easily compensate for the loss of this development perspective. This all made perhaps some sense when sectoral mobility and regional mobility was higher, and you could assume that people who are adversely affected by some economic shocks might then find a different job, a better job, some 5 or 6 years later. But those who are affected find it increasingly difficult to indeed make their own living and create a livelihood for themselves. And there's a lot of survey evidence about what people are concerned about. It is the economic situation for sure, but it's very often much more the loss of a development perspective. And I think this has to be put more in the focus of policies that want to mitigate these adverse effects. It's not about compensating losers. It's really about generating new development perspectives for individuals and for regions. There's quite some research papers who have tried to identify the economic mechanisms that translate economic shocks into populist voting. And it has turned out that labor market adjustments are a main driver of this whole development. So labor market policies certainly may help to also decrease populism. But many labor market policies or many current labor market policies are very much concentrated on avoiding unemployment. And this makes sense. Unemployment is, well, unemployment has for a long time been a driver of just not turning out in elections at all, also of unemployed people who just abstain from voting, and populists have been successful in mobilizing there. But much more than unemployed individuals, it is people who are in employment, but either fear losing their job in the future due to ongoing globalization, due to technological change that support populists, and people who just don't see potential for upward mobility anymore. And this is to say that labor market policies may help, but they must focus more on improve this upward mobility of people. This is, of course, always easy said, and one could discuss a couple of concrete ideas here, what to do concretely, but in the end, there must be a stronger focus on qualifying and on training those people on the job that lose out due to skill bias, not only in technological change, but in labor market developments more generally, to participate in this job upgrading that is going on. So there's also people who benefit a lot from these developments and who are also less likely to support policies. And it's not an easy task, but it is also a task that needs the cooperation of employers. But I think policy can incentivize qualification and training measures. policy can provide infrastructure, and also by demand side measures policy can do more to incentivize this training and qualification. Regional policies are important. We see that not only people who are directly negatively affected by labor market adjustments turn to support populists. It's also people who just live in those regions that are hardly hit, although they have a good job and they earn a decent income, that become susceptible to populist agenda. So the challenge is again to provide development perspectives for those regions who are left behind in this development. Concrete example, there's, I don't know if everybody's familiar with this, most people in Europe are, there's a large regional development policy program by the European Union, the European Regional Development Fund, that supports regions who earn less than 75% of GDP per capita. And own research and research by Albanese show that this program is not only successful in creating some development perspective, but also in mitigating populist support. So the program is designed in a way that you have a clear cutoff. If you earn less than 75% of the average EU GDP per capita, you're eligible for the program, and if you earn more, you're not eligible. This gives you a good opportunity to compare regions who are just a little bit richer than those who just received the funds. So you can compare regions that earn 80% to those who earn 70%. And you can argue that these regions are similarly poor in economic terms, and that the allocation of funds is quasi-random. And what you see is that the recipient regions of these funds are significantly less likely to vote for populist parties in elections. So the policy helps. It helps if you invest into regions, not only to provide development perspectives, but also to counter populism. The challenge is that this old ideal of regional development policies to allow for convergence, for poor people to catch up to the rich regions, would not say it has failed, but it has not very good consequences given this stark inequalities between the development of urban centers and peripheral regions. And there's an interesting policy set summarized under this buzzword of smart specialization that, and Thomas is looking at the watch, smart specialization that I only want to mention here, but not summarize. But I think here's also, similarly to the welfare policies, one needs a shift in focus to generate new trajectories according to the strength of the regions, to help peripheral regions to participate in the success that urban regions have. They can probably not catch up, but if you are a region in the periphery of an urban region, invest into communication structure and digital infrastructure to allow people to live there but work virtually or in person in the urban center. If you're a remote region with a scenic landscape, invest into green tourism to give this region opportunity to grow endogenously, even if it cannot catch up. Just to provide a perspective is often more important for people than to really have GDP income growth, as long as they see that there's a future for the region. Oh yeah. Migration is a big issue. It's not easily addressed by economic policy. In the end, migration is the topic that unites all the right-wing populists. And I think the more important policies to tackle this are migration and immigration policies. There's a scope for economic policy here if it comes to countering distributional conflict, whether it's really there because low-skilled individuals face labor market competition from immigrants that could then be addressed by the labor market policies, whether there is actual competition for scarce public goods, like hospitals, like daycare facilities in school. If you have a lot of immigration, it's probably not a good idea to cut down public spending in these areas where people then indeed face competition with migrants, which then makes them more susceptible for this anti-immigration rhetoric. But there's also, and this will then be in the paper, some opportunity for smart policy design to at least mitigate the perception of this conflict, even if it is not actually there. But in the end, the migration topic is a big thing, and it's complicated, and it's one of the areas where economics and culture most obviously strongly interact. I only say one word to the supply side. So if it is about policies to counter populism, all these policies before are mainly policies to counter dissatisfaction with the political system, whether it's then tapped or caught in by populists or somebody else, doesn't matter. The one thing that's really specific about populists, or one thing that's really specific about populists, is their success in political campaigning that depends on also innovative approaches to public communication, but potentially harmful approaches to political communication that has transcended into the mainstream, specifically in the US. I mean, if the US president stands there and tells in the midst of the pandemic blatant lies what you should do to fight the disease, inject bleach and stuff like that, I mean, it's crazy. And but it poisons this whole political debate, and that's an aspect I would be very interested in discussing. Bidenomics is the one thing, and the economic policies imposed are the one thing, but you have to bring the message across to the voter in the very end. So you have to convince the voter that you have a good policy that helps him or her, and how if Biden has a strategy here to fight this very specific rhetoric, this fact-ignoring rhetoric, I think this is a big challenge for him and his administration, and that's a big challenge for all the people who are engaged in public debates. My inclusion are here in writing, and you can read it by yourself. I have said what I wanted to say. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thanks, Robert. I taken just one thing that I remarked in what you said is, I now understand why populists are against the EU, when the EU apparently via their programs of involuntarily or voluntarily fighting against populism. We have an excellent panel, so we would immediately ask you to give your comments. Catherine, perhaps first, you are founder and director of Counterpoint, an agency or whatever you call it, who's advising governments, business people on social and on how to manage social and political risk, and that's what we're talking about. So excellent to have you, and please, your comments.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Robert, for your paper, which I read with great pleasure. And I think that's the first thing that I'd like to say, which is that I'm now based in Paris, but I've just spent the past nearly 30 years in the UK, and so I was, in a sense, I had a front row seat, if not actually a front row stage, on the Brexit lead up, but also the immediate aftermath of Brexit. And I think that one of the things that was most shocking about the way that the Brexit result was looked at, and then, you know, the diagnosis of the causes was looked at, was trying to actually separate out culture from economics. And it gave rise to an incredibly sterile debate. And people started talking about the left behind and trying to separate being left out culturally from the national conversation, from the national norms, from national values, from being left behind economically. So it's very good to be able to look at economics in a different kind of way. And I'll come back to this at the end of my comments, but one comment that I think one thing we need to keep in mind is not just who are the left behind, quote unquote, and why they feel this way, but actually who they imagine is leaving them behind. Because I think this is in part what fuels populism. It's how you imagine that elite that is doing the leaving behind of yourself or of your community. So I just want to make just 3 points that are essentially to address why I think you make great points about both the economic dynamics that drive populism and populist supporters and populist party voters, but also why it's so difficult for economic policies to actually succeed in countering populism, even if the causes are driven by this. So I think the first thing that I would say is that while we have, while we're busy trying to say economics is not just income, it's also about culture, and culture is socioeconomic, what the populists are very good at doing is actually separating culture and economics out just enough so that when a mainstream government or set of policymakers says, we're going to address jobs, populist parties are very good at saying, that's fine, but how are you going to address the change in our communities that we don't recognize? And when a mainstream government says, oh, well, we're going to address immigration, populist parties are very good at saying, well, that's fine, but we need jobs. So, they do that separating out, I think, quite effectively. The second thing that I wanted to say about labor reform, labor market reform in particular, is that not only does it take time, and we're going to see this, in terms of the window of opportunity that Biden has between now and the midterm elections, right? This is going to be the making or breaking of Bidenomics. But I think that one of the things about economic policy is that it is technocratic. It is necessarily technocratic. It's necessarily about expertise, it's complicated calculations, it's taxonomies, it's benchmarking, it's means testing. It is everything that the populist parties instrumentalize against the mainstream, and everything that populist party voters and supporters hate. It's this idea of a technocratic elite putting in place something which they see as both kind of technocratic and societal, as opposed to being sort of community or people-led and organic. And I think that, this is one of the huge hurdles that policymakers have to overcome, is that even the policies that would address so many of the dynamics or the grievances that are at the heart of populist mobilization, they are very easy to caricature and experience as the kind of technocratic, non-political, non-emotional kind of politics that so many of these citizens want. Just 2 quick points to conclude. One is that I think you made the great point about inequality. I think it's not about absolute income or where you sit absolutely on a scale. It's really about inequality. And there's a couple of things about this. One is that I think that it's also a failure of education, right? That lack of an economic development perspective is also about how we view higher education, apprenticeships, et cetera, et cetera. I think that is one of the policies that we need to take very, very seriously, because as you point out, and also as Martin Sandbu points out in his his really good book, The Economics of Belonging, it's about that lack of capacity to adapt. And that lack of capacity to adapt, yes, it's about technological change. Yes, it's about labor market transformation and so on. But it is also about, you know, a failure to educate for the needs of a future economy. But I have one comment and one question here. The question is, if labor market and more broadly economic policies are the key to this, and I do think that they are absolutely at the heart of this, then, you know, why not vote for the left, right? Why not vote for those who proposed economic solutions once upon a time? Now, part of the answer to that is that social democratic parties and socialist parties have themselves failed to adapt. But I think that the other thing here is that we shouldn't underestimate, again, going back to who is in power, the fact that this is also about a rejection of what is perceived as elite collusion, right? Elites that are failing to protect, but also who are really in it for themselves, elites who have usurped their power. And I think that this is, you know, this is very important. And this is where populists are able to capitalize by simply saying we're not like them, right? Regardless of what policies they put forth. And then I guess, you know, just to conclude, because this is something that I was very struck by when we did work on, you know, different communities, specifically in England, but also in Scotland. But Scotland is a different case, but specifically in England. One of the things that we kept saying to people was, you know, you do realize that this vote, particularly in communities that had supported Brexit, this vote will probably, the consequences are probably that it will make you poorer, right? That this will not improve either your socioeconomic status or your income, certainly not, you know, in the short term. And actually, the answer that we got to that was, we don't care, right? We don't care. We don't care about being poorer. And the second part of the answer was, because we'll all be poorer together, right? So this goes back to this, you know, inequality, but also the imagined community here. And the real, you know, the real resentment against not just the left or the right, but, you know, a political class, those who've usurped either their wealth or their position. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not just about being better off or having better prospects. There's also something that has been changed in part by the communications that you were alluding to, Robert, in part by the kind of media, both the new media, but also the old media. You know, let's not forget the work of the tabloids, you know, very traditional media, you know, in the UK. The work of the media in really creating a polarization and an emotionality that actually drives people to say things like, I don't care that I'll be poorer, you know, we'll all be poorer together, you know, which is where the notion of community and the people actually comes in and connects to populism. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
We don't hear anything.
Okay, yeah, okay, that's better. Sorry, I would like to hand over to Dalia Marin, who has already joined us in September, talking about unification and the role that Treuhand has played and structural policy have played at that time, promoting sort of populism, and with some hope that this will turn to another side, to a positive side now. But now your comments, please, on Robert.
I would like to share my slides. Okay, so my comments to this, my contribution to this panel will focus on globalization and populism in Germany. So basically, there are two reasons why globalization has no role to play for the rise of the right-wing party in Germany, the AfD. And the two reasons are, first, there is a wrong time pattern. And the second is that right-wing populism is mainly an East German phenomenon. So let me explore these 2 points. So to wrong time pattern. When you look at the openness of the German economy, you see that the openness is stagnating since the financial crisis. And this picture shows this. So what you see here is in the periods between 1990 to 2008, the openness of the German economy was expanding fast. People have called this period the period of hyperglobalization. And this period of hyperglobalization ended in 2008 when there was this trade collapse. Then there was the recovery of trade. And what you see in this table is since 2011, the openness of the German economy is stagnating. At the same time, when you look at the evolution of the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, the right-wing populist party in Germany, you see that the AfD started to exist in 2013 as an anti-Euro and an anti-Greek bailout party. Only after 2015 became the AfD a xenophobic, anti-immigrant right-wing party. So what I'm arguing is that this time pattern, the rise of the AfD, happened after 2015, while globalization is stagnating already since 2011. This speaks against the role of globalization for the rise of the AfD in Germany. And now I come to the AfD that the AfD is an East German phenomenon. The numbers I show in this slide, it shows you the AfD's electoral share in the Neue Bundesländer in East Germany. So it's between 23 and 27%, while in West Germany, it takes 5 to 10%. So why is the AfD so strong in East Germany? To get to an answer, we have to look at the political reforms after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So basically what you see is the reforms contain the liberalization of trade with the former DDR. Basically the tariffs fell from 100% to 0. At the same time, there was a currency reform in which the East German Ostmark was exchanged to the Deutschmark at the rate of 1:1. As a result of this currency reform, the East German wages rose to 70% of the West German level, even though productivity in the East was only 30% of the West. So as a result, the manufacturing sector immediately went bankrupt overnight. And as a result, we have the deindustrialization of East Germany. So after 1989, when the economic convergence process started between East and West, it started in the first 5 years, there was a rapid convergence, but with the demolition of the Treuhand, which privatized East German assets, this convergence process came to a halt. So basically the convergence process stopped around 25 years ago. And at the same time, this convergence process was accompanied by a false narrative. And this false narrative said that East Germany has nothing to sell to the world. But that was so East Germans had very low self-esteem because they felt they had nothing to sell to in a market economy. But in fact, it was the currency reform that robbed the region of its cost advantage. So the economic conditions and the low self-esteem of the population in East Germany are the drivers of the AfD's success in East Germany. In this, globalization has no role to play. East Germany is a closed economy with little exposure to international trade and little exposure to immigrants. So there is a theory of intergroup contact, which was developed by sociologists and psychologists, which argues that little interaction with foreigners supports xenophobic feelings. And in fact, a recent study for Germany indeed finds that more refugees in a given municipality correlate with fewer votes for the AfD in 2017. Now, let me come to the US. The China shock in the US, the China shock in the US led to large job displacement. And the important thing about it was that it was a displacement that was not spread widely across the United States. The China shock was particularly concentrated in particular regions and destroyed the entire ecosystem of that region. So in some of these regions, the job losses accounted for 8% of the total employment. And a recent study showed, in fact, that the China shock led to the victory of Donald Trump in the US. So why is it that Germany didn't suffer from the same fate? First of all, China shock was much smaller in Germany compared to the US. So in the US, the Chinese import share between 2000 and 2008 increased by 24 percentage points in the US, while in Germany it increased by 14 percentage points in the same period. Moreover, the Chinese competition displaced imports from Southern Europe and Turkey, and therefore hurt Southern Europe and Turkey, but didn't hurt Germany. And the last thing is that Germany had the opening up of Eastern Europe. And that meant that while the US, Eastern Europe doesn't play any role in the United States as a trade partner. So rising imports from China were more than compensated by rising export to China and to Eastern Europe. The rising export to China were extraordinary, but because the Chinese love the high quality German products. So what can we learn from the East German and US experience? We should provide assistance programs to lower the trade adjustment cost of affected regions. So for instance, the Green Deal, which says it gives support to regions which exit coal, is exactly the right measure to take. And the second measure is that you should try to establish new industries in dying regions. So in East Germany, the battery cell production for electric cars is an example of a successful instrument to combat dying regions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia. Excellent. I think that's is in a line with what Robert has said on the perspectives. That would be perspectives for the Eastern German economy. Let's go to overseas, and first to Tom Ferguson from INET, who has done a lot of research on populism and politics. And please give us some insights on the question if Bidenomics will be the blueprint of how to go against populism.
There, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I guess these days under COVID, I always begin by saying it's a pleasure to be here because, you know, the chances of not being here in the last year were a little too high for comfort. But I'm glad that everybody else made it too, including I can see quite a number of my friends around, and including, of course, Robert, who works in part under a grant from my organization, the INET. And I'm almost in a position to sort of do the Hubert Humphrey, the old Democratic politician, saying I basically agree with everybody I don't quite, but it really doesn't matter. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it today. Let me just try to sort of set up the Biden story. You know, it's the anniversary of George Floyd's death. And actually today comes the news that the infrastructure bipartisan talks may actually be on the verge of collapse. And then also some news that US corporations are sitting on enormous piles of money already in their various campaign accounts. So they're getting ready to spend. This was after a number of them had all said they would perhaps not fund people, Republicans supporting that insurrection on January the 6th. So there's a lot to think about here. And since I only got 7 minutes, I think I'll just go straight into the business here. First of all, how best to put it? There's not one, but a whole string of shocks that hit the U.S. political system more or less all at once. And the campaign is only one of them. Start with what actually happened, which was that Bernie Sanders lost the primary to Joe Biden. And it was basically over before COVID hit. But the big issue that Sanders spotlighted, which was medical care and the absence of health insurance for everybody, immediately turned into really the biggest issue for lots of people there was. Now, the government did a kind of barely bipartisan. They argued back and forth, the Republicans and the Democrats, but they did finally announce that, well, the government would pick up the cost for at least COVID testing. It turns out that's not been honored, and that lots of hospitals are still billing people. Now, my point is that it's a bad scene when, in effect, if you like, the moral impossibility of doing what everybody sort of knows needs to be done, so sort of starts as the campaign goes on. I mean, that's a problem. Then when Biden won, you have to pay attention to how he won. He won by way more than he needed to actually be sure the vote count was obviously okay. That's clear. But the Democrats did not do nearly as well as they thought they would in either the House or the Senate. They got a 50-50 tie in the Senate in the January elections in Georgia. But their House majority, which I think at the time of the election day was probably around 10 or 11 votes counted, it's down to about 7 now. It could drop a bit more too. But the point is, what happened there? Now, one explanation, the most popular, because there were all kinds of people saying that the Democrats had a huge swing in money from business to them. That turns out not to be true. My colleagues and I published this. You can see the graph on the INET website. The big surge of money for the Democrats just didn't materialize in the congressional races. It's the usual. We've long shown that you get a linear model outcome. That is to say, the percentage of votes, percentage of cash is between the two major parties are quite strongly correlated. And no, that is not because of some endogeneity in where the cash goes. We can show you that that's false too. But so you got to think about this. Is there really how much of a majority is there for Biden at least at the time of the election? Maybe narrow. What if you were looking at an odd outcome that COVID created? That's a scary prospect. It's scary because, yes, it's true. Anyone who followed the events in the United States on January 6th realizes that's not politics as usual. You could cite a few things before the Civil War as sort of predecessors, but basically nobody has really tried to overturn an election like that ever. You've got to just deal with the fact, I was very slow to jump to this. I never thought that even the right-wing Republicans were really fascist. But the current crowd that does the big lie that the election was stolen and just says this over and over and over, it's obvious that if they were to come back to power, they might well never allow themselves to be counted out again. Right now, the Republicans are going through state legislatures and trying to shift the way votes get counted in the states in the appeals process. And they are, of course, making the traditional strong effort to dampen down the vote. So this is, this better not fail, basically, in the Biden effort. Now, what do we think of the Biden effort? First thing to be said is, the relief program, when he went big for that, it's clear, I think, that, and it passed on a narrow vote, but it passed. That's clearly boosted his popularity, though it's not, if you look at it in historical perspective by folks say, a couple hundred days out, it's not particularly high by historical standards. But yeah, the going big for relief was popular. And there is a kind of little glow now around there. On the other hand, look slightly beneath that and you get a different perspective. I mean, one big problem is that every major business organization in the United States has rejected the Biden proposed tax program. I mean, he had one for the corporation income tax that was immediately rejected by everybody. And the proposals to raise, for example, personal income taxes and a variety of others. We haven't got time to go into the details. Those are all flatly rejected. Moreover, if you look, say, at the Texas vote on the legislature's ability to get into votes, while all these corporations were saying in the immediate aftermath of January 6th that, well, they wanted to be woke and were even signing protests against pushing blacks out of the voting universe again. Many of them in Texas did not live up to that pledge. I think the article, you can just read it in the Wall Street Journal, actually. It's perfectly straightforward, I think, what's going on there. Now, beyond that, many of what you think would be the natural allies for Biden, pretty obviously in the labor movement, well, the effort to organize Amazon failed. The minimum wage increase, which was hugely pushed by labor, didn't pass. It's probably not going to happen. And actually, it's quite striking that Biden they have not really put through any new rules on occupational health and safety, which the US badly needs. More broadly, the Biden administration doesn't have a clear exit strategy for getting out of COVID. They have basically just relied on the God from a machine, the vaccine. But they're not going to hit herd immunity. Nobody has a vaccine for people under 12. You can see there's some clear labor market disarray, sometimes just said to be coming from people don't want to work. That seems improbable. What you do have are many people are still staying home to take care of kids. And the whole daycare system, not just in the formal daycare, but how you park kids in schools, that's all broken at the moment. And it's not clear how they fix this, particularly with all these folks. In the revisions of the British analysis of school transmission, show you that people forgot to count all the folks who had asymptomatic COVID and passed it on to folks above them. It's pretty obvious that in the fall in the US, not in the summer, because people go outside, at least in the north, and it dropped last summer, it'll drop again. You may face at least a weaker second wave, because vaccination really does seem to work thus far. But the Biden folks are just sitting there telling everybody to go back to school. This is made to order for trouble. And the CDC, our Center for Disease Control, is giving, well, the nicest thing I can say is pretty strange guidance that's been heavily criticized by lots of doctors. Add all this up, and the fact that they are, in effect, they haven't got an infrastructure compromise, and they don't have much progress on the, I think it's called the American Families Act. Think of it as the social capital bill, if you like. Could this fail? Yeah, it might. And of course, the terrible shadow is in 1994 and in 2010, the first term after a first election cycle after a Democratic president got elected, the Democrats were creamed both times. Now, Biden did the right move, which was to do something big enough to make a difference in people. But if nothing else happens, I mean, I have to say that I think the discussion today was a bit superficial in that the fundamental problems, not just in the US, which is kind of always a funhouse mirror of what Europe is really going through too. I mean, we just do it on a colossal scale and worse generally. The fundamental problem is that, it's as our sort of I-network in the dual economy has sort of stressed, Peter Temin, Service Storm, lots of other folks now. You used to move people from the countryside into the city, and when they take higher productivity jobs. Now we're running that stuff in reverse. Huge amounts of people just can only find low wage work, and people are building business models based on that. And in the US, since you have such weak social protections, that's a real horror show. And the problem is you can't just go back to normalcy. If you try that in the United States, you'll see another cycle of populism. I mean, that's the problem, not simply imports or something like imports were certainly part of that process. But this reverse W. Arthur Lewis process, as Lance Taylor called it in his book, another INET thing, that's the essence of this problem. And it's, the jury is out on whether Biden can solve it. I hope he does, because if he doesn't, who knows?
Thank you, Tom. We're a little running out of time, and we have a very important comment from Timo. You've done an excellent paper some years ago already on Brexit, establishing a very clear link between the regions that have suffered from structural problems and then the austerity shock in 2010. So the mix of both seems to have very clearly explained where Brexit has been voted for. What are the lessons you take out of this when it comes to policy measures? And is there something already done in the UK?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this. Let me just pick it up. Obviously, I have a particular interest in austerity as a topic, and Robert did an excellent job at summarizing, a lot of this work that is going on. And what we see in the UK is that, places and people who have been hit by austerity were increasingly more likely to vote for and support essentially populist agendas, where Brexit is obviously one of the incarnation of that populist agenda. But that was just activating existing grievances, which have been highlighted in particular by Robert's excellent sort of review, which suggests that actually a lot of the structural issues were there, and the welfare state was, so to say, the band-aid to patch that was then sort of violently removed, which sort of enabled this backlash to follow out. At some level, this highlights obviously the importance for state interventions. But I think in terms of the populism as a phenomenon more broadly, we have to think about the supply side as well as the demand side. A lot of the focus has been on the demand side in this discussion, which is what are the origins and the economic drivers and so on that lead to sort of broader popular support for populist agendas. But I think the big structural issue that we face, and that I think actually Robert mentioned towards the end, is to what extent we can actually tackle the supply side issues. Bidenomics is in that sense, very good economic policy. Let's see how much gets through in terms of actual policy outcomes. But it actually fails to tackle some of the supply side issues that I would say matter a lot. And this goes to the heart of questions around, does representative democracy still work in the way that it was designed with the underlying checks and balances in place, where obviously the media plays a very vital role in the process of transmitting information about the effectiveness of policymaking intervention, when nowadays through social media and the sort of, particularly in the US, the overly politicization of the media landscape narrows the ability for media sort of to effectively provide and shine a light on policy successes and policy failures, which obviously lead to a significant risk that the media itself becomes a vector of entrenching political power, which in the UK I think is quite evident. In the US to some extent, it's also quite, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that this is happening. And all of this happens in the context of the technological transformation in the media landscape that changes not just what is being reported on, how things are being reported on, how people consume news, but also who becomes a content generator, which I think becomes very important to understand going forward. And I think there's a lot of more research work needed in a day and age where at the end of the day, social media is sort of supporting essentially the idea of a narcissist entering the media landscape, and many people cannot really make a living as sort of a content generator in traditional media anymore. That sort of has a deep structural hollowing out issue that I think is very important. So we have the media, then we have politics as well. Who can afford to become a politician, which in the US is a very important question, whereby politics has become less responsive to actually incorporate broader parts of society, in particular also because of the erosion and the democratic deficits that sort of start at the very bottom up at local political levels, and obviously will find its way to the national level. And I think the third bit that I think is very important to mention as well is, and this is where austerity again plays in, austerity had and will have a very long lingering effects, even though now there's an effective turn towards more expansive fiscal policy also in Europe, which is very welcome. But it will linger because de facto it led to the erosion of the state's ability to actually deliver in an effective way. Through hiring freezes, it meant that ultimately there was an aging of the civil service that is not up to speed when it comes to new technology. There was a very limited training, which in some sense became very apparent in the pandemic, especially in Germany, whereby we're fighting a pandemic with 20th century in the 21st century with 20th century pen and paper tools and fax machines. So I think but the legacy, in my view, is that austerity has sort of led to this erosion of the state's ability to deliver. And there, I think I see a huge missed opportunity to actually, think about repositioning the state, and its role towards citizens, because it actually could have really done good for evidence-based policy making, bringing in, shining a light on the importance of experts and expertise for policy making, and at some level, our policy making and policy response was quite poor in many instances, and I think that is the danger that we now see ourselves in, where there's a missed opportunity, and it obviously does shape potentially give rise to views about how China and other countries might have handled it much better, but obviously without the consensus being that we're supposed to be, we're living in a liberal democracy with freedom of expression and a sort of broad representation of society through its political channels. So I think this is, for me, the most important issue, that Bidenomics and sort of the policy response really needs to start thinking about how the supply side routes to populism can be tackled, because there's only so much that can be done on the demand side by sort of reasserting the welfare state, by making sure that taxes actually do produce public goods benefiting broad society. So I think the supply side is really what is the big puzzle for us all, and what we all need to kind of focus our attention to in terms of our work and what we do. Thanks.
Thank you, Timo. We are a little lucky because Joe Kaiser is not yet completely there, but we just have some minutes left, unfortunately. Robert, would you answer to one of these comments?
Yeah, these are all excellent remarks, and should I pick up one? I want to stress again that I agree a lot with Timo on this last point. So what's really novel about populism as compared to just fringe policy demand or dissatisfaction with elites or so is exactly this populist rhetorics and the ability to introduce lies into an advanced political debate, and that's a poison. I mean, in the end, all good decisions depend on the quality of information decisions are based upon. And if this has success in the long run, that not fact and figures matter anymore for deciding about policy options, but opinions and beliefs and the will of the people, whatever that is. That's a huge threat for the model of the liberal democracy and of the free market economy. And when we talk about policy challenges, I would agree that this is currently the major challenge.
Thank you very much, Robert. Unfortunately, we can't continue this discussion immediately. I invite all you on the panel to stay with us, and maybe there will be other opportunities to discuss, because we'll keep in the topic and we will keep to discuss the same topic on globalization and how to reform globalization, capitalism. Now with a panel, with a talk between Joe Kaeser, who has just arrived in the room, former CEO of Siemens and now head of the advisory council of Siemens Energy, and online from Harvard, Danny Roderick, the most famous critic of globalization in the recent decades already, and having seen a lot of things that have come through since. So we're very happy to have you both, and I would invite Joe Kaeser to join us on the panel. I see Danny is already there, and I will hand over to Nicola Brandt, head of the Berlin OECD office, to moderate this session and introduce both partners. So,
okay. Join me? Okay. So, welcome everybody, Mr. Kaeser, Danny Roderick from Harvard, I assume. I have the immense pleasure to moderate this evening a debate between two men who have shaped the debate about reform of capitalism, what the future of it looks like, what works and what doesn't work. So we have Danny Roderick, who is a renowned Harvard scholar, Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard John F. Kennedy School of Government. And his research revolves around globalization and in particular around ways recently to make it more inclusive in developed and developing countries. And he's the author of Straight Talk on Trade, Ideas for a Sane World Economy. And it also already shows you that he thinks things may have to change in order for it to become sane. And here next to me is Joe Kaeser, who is has a long-standing career as a manager, CEO until February, or president and chief executive officer of Siemens AG, so a big a titan of German industry. And he's now the chairman of the supervisory board of Siemens Energy. But most notably, he's also participated in the debate about major global challenges like climate change, digitalization, etc., much more perhaps than other CEOs of Siemens before him. And so I'm very much looking forward to this debate. And Dani Roderick, being a professor, is going to introduce us into the subject with a presentation, so we can have a good starting point, and then I will raise my questions. Dani, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicola. I hope you can hear me. It's dangerous to give a professor the first word. It may go on forever. But I hope I will be more disciplined and just lay out a few thoughts. I was asked to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes. I hope not to exceed that. But I think what I'm going to say follows quite nicely from the discussion in the previous session, which most of which I was happy to listen to, and I think struck all the right notes from my perspective. I want to start my comments by focusing on globalization and how to think about a new globalization, although I will end by suggesting that in many ways the challenges of the future are not necessarily specific to globalization, but have much more to do with how do we create economies which are much better positioned to produce and supply adequate numbers of good, satisfying jobs for lower and middle classes. And in many ways, I think the rise of populism is in fact linked to the disappearance of good jobs. And we've heard this in the previous session, whether it is the collapse of industry in Eastern Germany after the transition, whether it's the China trade shock and its impact on local labor markets in the United States, whether it's the long-term impact of deindustrialization and decline of public services in Britain, the regional declines, spatial declines that show up in sort of the disappearance of good jobs, I think has been a key driver of populism and the rise of populist movements. Globalization has played its role, in some countries more than in others, but I don't think necessarily we should focus on globalization as the only source. And I think as we go forward, technological change and the institutionalization of labor markets are presumably going to perhaps play a bigger role. So I think we need to keep our eye on so where the issue is really, I would say, the supply side of the economy, the structure of the economy, and that's where I think our interventions will need to focus. But with respect to globalization per se, I want to start by saying that it wasn't that long ago when we thought that globalization was just a fixed thing, and it's really you were either for globalization or against globalization. And I want to clarify that I'm presented sometimes as a critic of globalization. I'm a critic of a particular form of globalization. I don't think one can sensibly be against globalization per se. I don't think anybody in his right mind is talking about autarky or completely closing up economies. But we're really talking about what kind of globalization we want. It wasn't that long ago when political leaders told us that we were not even allowed to debate the form of globalization. Bill Clinton said in the early 2000s, globalization is not something we can hold or turn off. It's the economic equivalent of a force of nature, like wind or water. Around the same time, Tony Blair in Britain said, I hear people say we have to stop and debate about globalization. You might as well debate whether autumn follows summer. So these physical metaphors suggesting that globalization is something just falls into our lap in a ready-made form, and it's absolutely futile to resist it. And all that we can do is really adjust to it. Our societies have to adjust to this completely exogenous force. Is something that was very much in the narrative of the 1990s and 2000s. In fact, globalization can take many different forms. And in fact, in our own historical experience in economic history, we've had at least 3 different types of globalization. The gold standard was a very different type of globalization. lots of labor mobility then, for example. You could go travel without a passport. Then we had after the Second World War, we had a kind of a Bretton Woods type globalization where the rules were much less ambitious. They really did not reach behind borders. And then after the 1990s, we've had a form of globalization, which I've called hyper-globalization, which in some ways went back to the gold standard understanding of globalization, where you increasingly societies were asked to conform to the requirements of the global economy and international competition, that they had to do certain things in order to be part of the global economy, as my quotes from Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, I think indicated. So in other words, the global economy became the end rather than the means for societies fulfilling their goals, such as full employment, full use of resources, domestic equity, and social inclusion, and so forth. So I think the key transition, I think, in the most recent period that took place in the 1990s is between sort of this earlier conception, the Bretton Woods conception of globalization, where essentially we viewed the world economy to be in the service of domestic economic political systems, to the post-1990 world, where in fact our domestic economic and political systems were asked to adjust to the requirements of a kind of a global economy. We see that in consequences of financial globalization and monetary fiscal policies becoming subject to the dictates of international capital markets, the requirement of international confidence. We see it in the international trade rules, the World Trade Organization, and variety of bilateral and regional trade rules, which went beyond the traditional preoccupation with tariffs and import quotas, but increasingly encroached on domestic policy areas such as subsidies, investment rules, intellectual property rights, sanitary and safety rules, environmental rules, and so forth. So I think we need to, I think the major transformation we need in the way that we think about globalization is really to reverse that ends and means relationship, go back to the post-war conception where the global economy was a means rather than as an end, and to think of the global economy and international competition as a means, as an instrument by which we should be, that allows us to attain our domestic economic goals. So I think this is not, doesn't mean that we should not have international rules or international agreements. I think they are important to discipline things like beggar thy neighbor policies or enforcing rules for global public goods. By the way, the most important global public goods are actually non-economic areas. There are things like global public health, avoiding pandemics as the COVID pandemic, or slowing down or reversing climate change. Those are probably the biggest areas where in fact we need more global governance, more global globalization of rules, so to speak, as opposed to the economic area. But I think in economic policy domains, I think the primary objective of our new strategy should be to ensure that domestic policymakers, domestic economic political systems have adequate room, they have the space within which they can recreate, if you will, domestic social bargains, prioritize the creation of good jobs economies that I was referring to, with globalization essentially being supportive of this rather than undercutting what governments have to do domestically. So I think globalization, a sensible globalization, one would be one that's sort of a much thinner set of rules on the international economic dimension. I think we can talk about the US-China, Europe-China competition. I think we will have to accept a certain degree of peaceful economic coexistence with China, understanding that we're in fact not able to change China's economic system, let alone its political system. And we should understand that countries, individual nations, have a right to protect their own standards, their regulations, their preferred tax regimes, but not necessarily a prerogative to export them or to enforce them on other countries. And we should be focusing on global governance on areas where economic gains are very large, as I suggested, and those are the areas where global public goods are particularly important, as I indicated. So all of this in terms of how we reconfigure globalization at a certain relatively high level of generality, but really this is the objective, is really to open up space for a domestic policy agenda. So in the earlier session, we were talking about Bidenomics. I think all countries have to figure out what their domestic project, domestic economic strategy is going to be. And that's really where the priority is. And I think here, this is where I'm putting my emphasis on sort of a set of policies that are primarily targeting the creation of good productive jobs for the middle classes. I think whether it's globalization, whether it's technology, whether it's the changes in labor market institutions, that's really the weakening middle, the squeeze in the middle is really, or the labor market polarization, as labor economists call it, I think is the fundamental sickness of our capitalist economies at the time. Now, it's important to underscore that the welfare state, which is the greatest invention, social invention of the 20th century, is extremely important, but is really inadequate to the task, because the welfare state was essentially built has essentially two planks. One is a set of pre-production interventions, investments in education, health systems, so forth, to prepare individuals for participation in the labor force, and a set of post-production redistributive instruments, transfers, income taxes, and so forth, to ensure that that people are subject to idiosyncratic risk or falling through the cracks, like getting sick or losing a job. They can be they have income support. Now, this is a fantastic system, but does not directly address the source of the problem when the problem is weak creation of jobs, when the problem on the economy is that for a variety of secular reasons, our sort of economic inequality and job insecurity are essentially a structural problem. And the welfare state simply treats the symptoms of this problem, does not treat the underlying problem. And again, this was an issue that came out in the previous panel where people said, welfare state is not going to be adequate for this. And I couldn't agree more. So in a variety of writings I've been doing in the recent couple of years, I've been working with a number of different dimensions of this, and I would just very briefly identify four key planks of what a good jobs approach, or what a productivist approach that directly targets this problem might look like. I don't have the time to go into the details, obviously. I'll just leave it there. So if we can have maybe just a slide that has those four. Next slide, please. If we can have the next slide. The next slide, please. Yes, so I think these are essentially the four elements. One is that we need to consider and improve our present active labor market policies and make them much more linked, coordinated with employers, so that it's not just that we're providing the kind of training that is of the type that employers need, but that employers also recognize a certain responsibility on them, that their human resource policies, their employment policies also have to be shaped with an eye towards local labor market realities and availability of local skills. Second, I would emphasize significant overhaul of existing industrial and regional policies which even though they often target employment or good jobs, the preferred instrument are subsidies to investment, subsidies to firms. And I think those ought to be reformed to target good job creation much more directly employment focused. Third, I think the most ambitious thing on this list would be thinking about our innovation and R&D policies as essentially shaped, directed by a wide range of public policies and public inducements, everything from the tax system, from the types of investments that public innovation agencies engage in, and that we need to move our AI, digital, new technologies investments in a direction that are much more friendly to labor, much more employment friendly, rather than incentivizing automation or AI tools and digital tools that are simply helping the most skilled employees and the largest platform firms. That's a wide open area where we have not even begun to think about, even though in a number of areas we understand, such as military technology or green technology, we understand the role of directed innovation. We have not put that idea of directed innovation with respect to labor market outcomes, employment outcomes as well. And finally, and here where I circle back now to what I started out with on globalization, which is that international economic policies that essentially provide a shield for this domestic economic agenda, because I don't think domestic protectionism or regional protection is the answer to a good jobs deficit, but we need to ensure that we have the right kinds of international economic policies that encourage firms to do what's up to them, pay their taxes, or also to ensure that domestic labor and social standards are not undermined by import competition from countries where the standards might be much, much weaker. So I think that's where ideas like anti-dumping, anti-social dumping would come into the agenda. But in order for those policies to work, you have to have the right kind of agenda. So I think all of these raise more questions than I have provided answers for. And I think with respect to the future of the globalization, I sometimes say that there is the good, the bad, and the ugly. The bad would be a collapse into the 1930s style autarky. I don't think that's likely. The ugly would be sort of continuing along the same path and assuming that we can revive the hyper-globalist consensus of the 1990s and 2000s. That's going to be ugly because it's not going to work. The good is a kind of globalization that actually opens up space and facilitates countries to pursue the right kinds of economic policy strategies at home and actually supports those policies rather than undermining them. So let me just stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Danny, for this introduction to the subject, and I'm going to dive right into it. I think the points you made were very interesting and very much fit perhaps your professional career in some ways, in the sense that Siemens moved from, when you started 40 years ago, from a company with that provided many good paying middle class jobs when you produced washing machines, dishwashers and telephones and many other things, of course. And now you've steered, well, the external conditions, but also you've steered the company full steam into digitization. You do focus on smart infrastructure. So things that will require much higher skills, perhaps, than what you produced 40 years ago. And you probably don't provide the number of good paying middle class jobs than you used to. So what I would like to know is, how do you see global companies that move into this direction? What is their role in ensuring, in this process that Danny mentioned, ensuring that the workers that work for you, but also more generally in the country, can benefit from such a development? So technological advancement, but perhaps also specialization through globalization, that they're on board and they can benefit from where the companies are going.
Well, I mean, we still somebody still produces dishwashers. It's called Bosch Siemens Appliances. But I think, first of all, Danny, thank you very much for, there's the camera. Somewhere here. So thank you very much for taking the time and bringing that up, because, besides, above and beyond the climate matter, what you have been referring to is certainly one of the most pressing topics of our time. And it has already, been developing over time. You talked about globalization, but the fact of the matter is you're only at the beginning of what one could say is a social divide, which is the fourth industrial revolution. And so what can companies do? I mean, look, it is not, we are not alone. We have the policymakers which need to set the framework. And then companies can act based on a framework. And the more global the standards are, the better off obviously everybody is, because it provides level playing fields for the companies to act. Now, if you look at the topic of companies, it's interesting because, Milton Friedman in the 70s had a very clear agenda for companies. And he said, look, the business of business is business. Or in other words, make sure that the shareholders get, the most value out of it and stay out of trouble of politics and anything else. Now, what might have been the right thing to do in the 70s certainly is not cutting it anymore at all. We need to move from a true shareholder-based value into what I call stakeholder capitalism, or you could also call it inclusive capitalism. And that means that we not only look at the shareholder returns, but also look at the purpose. What actually is the purpose of a company? We need to go look at our customers, we need to look at our employees, and now we have a fourth stakeholder, and that is actually society. And when I was putting my last strategic program in place, which has been then splitting up the company in three: healthcare, industrial automation, software, and the energy, I said, as the purpose, a company needs to serve society. And if it does not serve society, it should not exist. What was, quite a courageous statement. And the only one way you can do this, you need to perform as a company, at least as well as your peers do. If you don't perform, as well as your peers in your industry, just don't even say a word about the greater scheme of what companies are about on purpose. I think that's the first lesson. Perform, and then you should actually engage in societal values. And there's a lot, it's not monocausaic. It's not like you need to do this and then it works like that. You've got a multilateral world. You've got the industrial world. You've got developing economies. You've got the global, globalization, which I actually believe is a good thing, because that's been taking people out of poverty. Hundreds of millions of people, were moved out of poverty. Maybe it took a strain on the industrialized countries, on their society, because they need to share. But what right do we have to say we as industrial wealthy societies, we should keep everything by, on us and not have other poor economies, also people to give some wealth and some peace and all the nice things we have earned. So that's a general remark. I believe in terms of what can companies do, I think we need to be clear that a job is a value in itself. It is a societal thing. And the governments need to support that, because they need to create the framework so that, taxes are not a decisive matter. Nobody should go some places because the taxes are lower. Then if you raise taxes, you would need, or if you lower taxes, you would need to see, is that lowering the taxes, is that creating jobs? Or is it making the richer, means the shareholders, even richer? Think about the US tax reform 2 years ago, under Trump, or 3 years. time is running. I actually have been congratulating him in Davos. I said, Mr. President, if you lower the taxes aiming at creating jobs in your country, this is a good thing. But if you look what happened, basically nothing but all those companies took the money and were buying back shares. That's not exactly what you ought to do by lowering taxes. So there's got to be a framework which helps the company to create jobs, meaningful jobs. So that's a general statement. Now, looking forward, if you look at the fourth industrial revolution, if you look at, the Internet of Things finally making it into a connectivity which is global, you talk about an extraterritorial scenario. And that actually makes it even more complicated going forward because our society is used to a territorial integrity. Our law is about a country with borders. Now, if the Internet of Things connects everything, what you see is that there's an extraterritorial economy shaping up. So that automatically means we've got to have a global understanding on how we pay taxes. So as such, I really like the idea of the Biden administration to have a global taxonomy. I mean, if you have us, Siemens, for example, paying about 30% or north of 28% taxes, and then the Apples and Amazons and Facebooks of the world pay 10, you need to go see where do they actually do business because they are extraterritorial in nature. So that brings a whole new set of tasks to the policymakers in the world. And we duly and truly do need a new WTO, where we put the extraterritorial character of doing business, into a set of multilateral rules. Otherwise, this society breaks apart. I could go on and on and on, but the topic is so complicated because there are so many different things happening at the same time. So the causation is very hard to find. And by the way, just talking about Siemens, in the last 5 years, only last 5 years, we hired 240,000 people. Some, of course, replacing others, but we would not have been, forced to do that. So if we had been really after maximizing the money, there would have been a lot of opportunities to do so. We're not doing dishwashers anymore, but we're doing, things that defeat cancer. We are doing things that lower the emissions by 50% in 3 years. So there are a lot of stuff which you could actually add as a purposeful company.
And just as a follow-up for the good job creation, so we saw these elements that Danny Roderick highlighted, so active labor market policies, industrial relations, etc. So Siemens is in Germany, vocational education is very strong here. So how do you see the possibilities for a company like yours as technology advances to basically train the workers that are in the company to acquire new skills, to be able to master new technologies that have emerged? So would you say that this has to be something that, people change jobs or?
Well, look, I think for Siemens it's an easy thing. And for many other companies it's an easy thing. The topic is actually, how we put it one step or two steps higher to avoid what Danny was rightfully referring to, a further split of the society. I mean, that's the issue. Splitting, there's populism, there is split in society, as nationalism. It makes matters even worse because you've got protectionism, and then you will fall back into poverty or losing of wealth. So the key element clearly is training and education. So the sooner you do that, the better off we are. And there is not just a private sector topic, there's also a public sector topic on education. They've got to set the framework. And if anything, this whole pandemic is good for, it has brutally revealed, the lack of state-of-the-art education in schools. It also has revealed that even industrial economies like Germany, for example, is way behind, a modern way of online real-time teaching. And that brings you to the next subject, that not everybody can afford a few, iPads or what have you, or can afford a hyper fast internet pipe. So that's actually where the government needs to come in and set the framework. And it need to be very clear. A government which is always half in, half out, in the time of digitalization doesn't do any good. So you have two ways to do it. Either you leave it to the private sector to do the internet connectivity, the pipes. Well, then you run the risk that, those areas which are the rural areas, which are not highly populated, that they'll never get 5G nor 4G because they are so remote, and then nobody will invest because it doesn't pay. So that would actually call for the government to say, look, everybody's got access to the internet, and that's a public topic. Take it away from the rich, give it to the poor. It would be perfectly fine. So you need to divide what's public sector, what's private sector. And then, people will be able to do the application. We in Siemens, then the private sector not only needs to develop innovation and application for the business model of tomorrow, the private sector has to, and this means the companies, they have the responsibility to basically retrain the workers. That's the single most pressing item we have at hand today, because there's sort of McKinsey studies and what have you, a lot of studies saying between 1 of 16 to 1 of 10 of the current global workforce will have to be retrained in the next 5 to 10 years. And COVID actually has probably pulled that in. It goes quicker, it goes faster, because probably people were forced into doing something meaningful. So that means training, education, very clear task of the public sector on education, very clear task on the private sector to do the retraining of the current workforce. Much more important, by the way, than bringing back work from India or China or elsewhere, because that really doesn't help you a lot. If you bring back the jobs from Bangladesh, well, great. Then you have a textile industry here, and I don't mind to pay $5 more for a t-shirt or 10, that's fine. Problem is what happens to Bangladesh. They fall back into even worse situations than what they used to have. So it's a complicated matter, but it's a joint effort, because if we don't solve that societal divide, which is only at the beginning, because if the internet reaches the industrial world, it gets worse. It gets worse because the internet is simple. It actually cuts out the middleman. It cuts out the weakest force of the value chain. People call it customer benefit. Sure, but the ones who are being cut out don't feel so good about it. And it's binary. It's not like you lose market share from 25 to 22%. Oh, well, you're still okay. No, you're not. You're going to be taken out of the value chain. It's binary, 1-0. So that means the societal divide goes even further. And that can only be sort of bridged by good education, by innovation, and looking for the next areas of growth, preferably in sustainability, because we don't have a planet B, so we need to go something.
Right. Thank you very much. Then to look at the United States, so picking up on this theme, education and training that is needed, but also access to infrastructure for people to be able to be successful in a digitalized world. I would also like to dwell a little bit on another aspect of this that we've seen quite painfully in this pandemic. So the hollowing out. So one end, in terms of the type of jobs, quality of jobs, skills, where the number of jobs is increasing is of course high skilled on the one end, but on the other hand also service sector jobs, healthcare jobs, for example, that cannot be automized, cannot be brought offshore. And we've seen that often they are not very well paying, they're not very attractive, and I think the Biden one program of the Biden administration is also to make these jobs more attractive. So training is of course very important, but the service sector jobs. So what needs to be done about this element of the hollowing out of middle skilled jobs, if you will?
Yeah, I think that's very important, and I want to say a little bit about those service sector jobs, and then tie that to the question on technology, innovation, and education and training. That first of all, let me extend my appreciation to Joe Kaiser and I think his very important comments about both about the role of corporations and the need to think of them as entities with a purpose, as well as what he said about the role of jobs being a kind of a value in themselves. That is, that I think work does not define us, but it gives us purpose. And I think it's not only about the pay, although the pay is probably the single most important thing, but I think the life satisfaction we get from doing purposeful work, I think, is very important. And sort of in my definition of good jobs, certainly those broader aspects of jobs would be very, very important. Now, I think, Nikolai, I mean, you're absolutely right that I think first, I mean, the bulk of jobs in the years ahead are going to be created in the service sectors of our economies: education, health, personal services, other services. That's really where the jobs are going to be created. Manufacturing industry, I think those are, they will remain important parts of our economies in terms of driving innovation and R&D, but they're not anymore sort of the driving, spearheading employment creation. So I think as we think about public policies for good jobs, it will have to be very different in some sense for how we thought about job creation 2 or 3 decades ago, or in the early decades of the post-war period, where it was really about global competitiveness, export champions, the most innovative manufacturing firms, industrial entities, and so forth. So the direction will have to be necessarily, if we take seriously the notion that our central deficit is, aside from our challenges on the climate front, our central deficit in capitalist economies is on the good job creation front, that our focus will necessarily have to be largely focused on services. Now, their public policies and government policies have a very important role in terms of establishing floors on what kind of jobs and employment conditions. And I think so Biden's attempt to raise the minimum wage, his attempt to improve the ability of unions and the coverage of collective bargaining. I would take that all the way to thinking about in terms of sectoral, labor agreements, even when sectors that are not necessarily unionized or when unions are not well represented. Essentially, public policy has a significant role in establishing a certain floor on wages and work conditions, and that's an appropriate role for government regulation. But we need to understand, and here's where I'm going to come back to technology and education and training, that we can't just succeed simply by increasing our aspirations and raising the floor on wages and work conditions, because if we're not simultaneously creating the possibilities of productive employment in those sectors, simply raising wages and work conditions will mean that we won't be creating enough jobs. The private sector will simply shy away from creating the jobs that are required. So it has to be that as we target more good jobs creation in health, education, in other service sectors, we're also doing it in a kind of a productivity enhancing way. And here where I think we come back to sort of, one of my planks on sort of this good jobs program, that we are currently taking the R&D innovation efforts of our societies essentially completely exogenous, as if it was something that wasn't under our control, that it couldn't be used directly to augment the skills of less skilled, less educated workers in these kinds of middle skill sectors in our services. And in doing so, in treating innovation and technology as exogenous, I think we're in danger of making the same error that I started out by pointing out in the context of globalization, that we took globalization as a given, that there was nothing we could do to change its rules. And yet, I think in too much of our current narrative, it's all about, workers have to adjust and invest in education and training and skills and retraining. And, society has to adjust to technology. Well, if there's a gap between what technology requires and what society is able to produce in terms of skills, maybe some of the adjustments should fall also on technology, on the direction of technological change. So what I have in mind are sort of very concrete things like investing in digital and new technologies that actually augment the skills of less skilled teachers, less skilled health workers, less skilled service sector workers, because I think the greatest ally of increasing good job creation in those sectors is to create more customization, more ability to produce more differentiated services. For example, in education, by empowering less educated and less skilled, less experienced teachers to provide very customized education to different small groups of students according to their learning needs, having real-time information about how that is going. That process of customization, differentiation, niche services is both a way of increasing the productivity of some of the less skilled in the professionals, and also increasing the demand for their services because they are providing. So you can imagine that in the health services, a lot of labor absorbing, but that's not necessarily happening because of the incentives and the norms and the narratives around technological change are not particularly geared towards these social problems. So our existing tax systems essentially subsidize investment in machinery, in capital, and they tax labor. So of course, you'll have innovation that's much more focused on replacing labor, automation. We don't have public innovation programs that are directly targeting new technologies that are going to augment skills and labor at the lower and middle part of the skill distribution in the way that I'm just suggesting. We just leave it to Silicon Valley to develop that kind of innovation programs according to their norms and their narratives around innovation. Similarly, relative power. Who has the power within enterprises to have a word on what kind of innovation technology gets employed and adapted? I think if we were to raise the voice of workers and unions, I think we probably would see a very different pattern of innovation in the enterprise. Germany is a relative leader in this area, but I think there's a lot more that still could be done as we understand that the direction of technological change is directly impact society and it's not completely exogenous. And I think once we have that, we can start to experiment a little bit more about the various policies and tools that we might have in that area.
Is that something that speaks to you? So could Siemens develop more, or perhaps you already do that, rather than, having technologies that replace workers, develop technologies that augment their skills in some ways by customizing certain tasks? And if so, would you say, so what role do unions play in terms of shaping a little bit the type of innovation R&D that companies do, and what role should they play?
Well, let's say in terms of co-determination, as we call it, or unionizing in the US, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the US. I understand also in the Amazon case, and I think it was down south somewhere. The good thing about this German model of co-determination is that there is an interactive dialogue about structural transformation. And that's the best thing out of it, because those people are so close, to manufacturing, to the places where they come from. They represent their people, obviously, in the manufacturing and engineering, sales, anywhere. service area, so they know exactly what's right and what's wrong. Sometimes much better than those management people in the ivory tower, not knowing nothing about what's going on in the organization. That's a good thing. If it gets complicated, if this co-determination becomes co-management, then it gets complicated. Reason being, you know, that the workers' representatives in Germany are being elected by German workers. Now they ought to co-manage a global enterprise, which is, you know, like in the case of Siemens, has 90% of its revenues outside the country. So how could they potentially, you know, look at the greater good of the international company if they're being elected by people in Germany? So they would always look at Germany, right, first, and then see what else is there. Another good thing, and that is about co-determination and legislation, is that Germany has a lot of good tools to bridge temporary volatility. For example, in COVID, you know, people, you know, the companies pay into social welfare, into taxes, in order to have this what we call short-term work. That means if you have a temporary fluctuation, people are not get fired, like we've seen in for example, in the US, from almost full employment to 6 or 7 million people get, you know, losing the job in 4 weeks. So we've been sort of, you know, bridging that, which is good, because once the economy goes up, demand goes up, you got those people, and not look for them again, because, you know, yeah, typically scarce good. So that's a very positive. Downside of it is you got to be very careful to see what is temporary in nature and what is structural in nature. And if you try to bridge structural issues with temporary matters, you know, you're actually losing time to restructure and reskill people's future. So it's not always, you know, it's not black and white. So you always need to go see. It depends on what is at hand. But then again, you know, training, education, reskilling, that's what we really need to go look. We spend in Siemens, we spend about $600 million every year for training, education, and reskilling. $600 million every year, a lot of money. And I'm actually, and Danny knows that, I'm at the US Business Council. For some reason, we were invited because that put like 25 billion revenues in the US. And I have about 60,000 people there. And we had a discussion on same topic about a year ago. And I was on stage with prominent people like Bezos and the likes. And I was mentioning that, and there were a lot of CEOs in the room, you know. And I was mentioning that, and Alan Murray, the guy from Fortune, was actually moderating the session. You know them, right, Danny? And then Alan was asking and said, "Hey, Joe, what do your shareholders say if you waste 600 million of their money, which would actually be about 70-cent dividend per share?" And so I was sitting there, you know, as this European person, with all those omnipotent CEOs, Bezos and Jamie Dimon, all those big guys, right? Benioff and so on and so forth. All those legends, Nadella from Microsoft. And so for a second, I was holding my breath, because I wasn't sure, should I just shut up and say, well, you know, or just say it. And then I thought, okay, here we go. It's Chatham rules, so let's get it out. And I said, look, Alan, if shareholders believe that's waste of their money, they better sell the shares. This is not a prison. And you could have heard a needle drop in the audience, because obviously, you know, shareholders, Wall Street is everything. If you miss it by a cent, and so it was a lively debate about it. It was 3 years ago. Today, if you hear the Business Council people talk, they all talk about purpose. They all talk about stakeholder capitalism. So it seems that there is a movement in the understanding that's got to be something else than share buyback programs, than things like that. And so I'm very hopeful, actually, that the big leaders who are the movers and the shakers, who are being listened to, not just whether Bitcoin is a good thing or a bad thing. I think that's a bad discussion. But, about the general purpose of jobs, of being inclusive of society. So if that starts now developing, I'm actually pretty positive that the leading companies in the world will make that difference and others will follow. So there's not everything is bad, but we are at the 11th hour, or like in Germany, we say 5 minutes to 12. Or fourth and goal for the ones who do NFL. Because if that Internet of Things now is really starting and technology can do that already, we have artificial intelligence, we have the tools, we can basically build from anything, can build a digital twin, even from people's bodies, brain, and then and optimize that digital twin and bring it back to real world changes. Now, obviously, in healthcare, there is the regulator and what have you, but on things we can do that. We combine the real world with the virtual world. With that, we probably cut the time to market, means the speed of innovation in half. Time to market cut in half. The total, the cost for products, the design to cost, is probably between 30 and 50% cost reduction. So think about this, and that needs to be multiplied. Innovation and productivity, great customer value. But the question is, if that all comes to the workforce, and you cannot equalize it by growth, additional growth, we have a real problem, like a real problem. And we won't have self-driving cars on the street if we cannot integrate the social divide. We're going to have burning cars in the street and not self-driving ones. So that's actually what really keeps me up at night, on how to bring that together. So we need to create meaningful applications which, are accessible to the next layer of demand by bringing the cost down for healthcare. Go from experience-based to knowledge-based healthcare. We could probably bring it down 30, 50%, so more people can afford healthcare. The total cost for cars, for services, we need to bring the cost down so that more people can afford it. And that brings, the demand and supply together. Otherwise, they have a real problem, because productivity is almost unlimited with artificial intelligence and have the digital twins on the real and the virtual world. And so then the question is, what will the regulator play? What will, let's say, the different global systems play? We have a clear systemic competition between the China model and the Western democratic model. And those are the questions which need to be solved. That means about multilateralism. That means that we have global rules of engagement in terms of the conditions of work. Don't go to Bangladesh because children can work, just a no-go. So we need to have international standards which need to be adhered to. And the same is, of course, true for sustainability. Otherwise, it's going to get complicated. So we have a lot on our table.
Do these things you just mentioned, so human rights standards along international supply chains, but also sustainability, the green transition, is that something that states have to regulate, perhaps on a multilateral basis, or what are the rules of what can companies do to make sure that they they maintain those standards? So in Germany, we're talking about a supply chain law, and should it be mandatory?
First of all, I mean, the governments of this world need to set the rules, framework. Because it's got to be preferably a global framework. WTO reform could do that. If that doesn't work, hopefully there are multilateral agreements between the big economic powers in the world. So what can companies do? Well, companies can, first of all, make sure that their area of influence is 100% covered. And the area of influence means no matter which factory we are talking about in Siemens, whether it's Bangladesh, United States, Russia, China, we have the same rules. No children work, no forced labor, environmental standards, safety standards, EHS and what have you. So that's the minimum companies can do. And then the second topic obviously is that that companies can force their suppliers, assuming they have a purchase power, their suppliers to adhere to the same rules. And that's what you call this supply chain law, Lieferkettengesetz. I'm a big supporter of it, as long as it's not that bureaucratic. It needs to be, practical. Because if you only have a responsibility, or if you're only accountable and not have a responsibility to check, it's no good. So I would say, any company, no matter what it's big ones or small ones, are responsible for their suppliers' conduct. And I would cut it there. To look at the supplier's supplier, come on, just cut it. I mean, make sure your suppliers adhere to it, and then we'll see what happens. So that's the type of stuff we can do, and enforce it on the supply chain side.
Danny, we heard that not only technology is really transforming things, but perhaps also globalization. And just to look at the change in administration in the United States, there are many things that have changed also in terms of economic policy. So Biden is suggesting a vast expansion of government spending on social programs, on infrastructure, also the green transition. He wants to also use public procurement to rebuild domestic supply chains. Janet Yellen, she's pushing also for the odds that we will have an agreement on a global minimum tax, corporate tax in the OECD framework have perhaps improved.
It will be really desirable.
Would you say that this is the kind of shift of dealing with globalization and technological change that will bring about these good or focus on good jobs? What is happening in the United States there?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that we're sort of in the midst of a transition, both an ideational one as well as a policy one. I think the global financial crisis essentially had significantly undermined the kinds of the economic paradigm that existed until that time. Sometimes it's called neoliberalism, sometimes it's called market fundamentalism, Washington consensus. But there was a kind of a sense of the good rules of behavior for on the economic policy front. And it's clearly after the pandemic and with Biden coming to power in the US, I think it's quite clear in the US that many of these that old rules don't apply. I mean, you have a Federal Reserve, a central bank in the United States today that's telling sort of economists, don't worry too much about inflation. That's the central bank. You mentioned many other policies, the Biden administration with sort of its fiscal policies, its Buy America policy, shoring up domestic supply chains and so forth. So I frankly, I'm not sure, this is, there's certainly, I welcome kind of getting out of the box and trying out new things. Famously back in the 1930s and 1936, when Franklin D. Roosevelt found himself president in the midst of a Great Depression, and his rallying cry was, we have to experiment. We find ourselves in a situation that's unprecedented. Our existing tools aren't adequate to the task, so we try and try. If something doesn't work, we try something else, and the only thing to fear is fear itself. And so it's I wouldn't necessarily describe Biden as today's FDR, but there's an element of that and getting out of the box. Now, would I sign up for everything that he's doing? I think that's sort of secondary issue. I think we can, but that would be, sort of rather sort of kind of ungracious. I think that we do need a change in our existing policies. I think Biden has provided a kind of a directional push that's certainly in the right direction. As we heard in the previous session from Tom Ferguson, I believe that it's not quite clear whether he's going to get his way with the Republican opposition and so forth. But I think directionally it's in the right way. Is that all going to amount to a new paradigm? I mean, I wrote a short piece a week ago called Beware of Economists Bearing New Policy Paradigms. So I'm not a big policy paradigm person. I think we just need to be flexible. We just need to understand that different circumstances require different policies. And if there is going to be a paradigm to come out of it, some future economists will describe it in 10 years from now, but it's, our ability to see it at present, I think, is very limited.
So we just, with Joe, we focused on international rule, the importance of something like a global corporate minimum tax, for example, but sometimes in these international negotiations, you don't get an agreement. And you mentioned how important it is still to not treat neither globalization nor technology shifts as natural forces, but saying you are able to shape them as policymaker, perhaps also as a country. But is that still true if we have this fourth industrial revolution, Internet of Things, etc.? How can an individual country shape, ensure minimum standards if we don't get these international rules?
I think they really do apply, and I think we would be again making a mistake by if we thought that the world is now so interconnected and technological possibilities so unlimited that either we have global rules or it's anarchy. I think national governments still have a big role to play, and frankly, when national governments decide to have rules that they want their own residents and their own nationals and their own corporations to uphold, but they don't get agreement from other nations, they have the full capacity and in fact obligation to go alone. I think a good area where we've made some progress, and I think most people understand that if Europe today is going to really go seriously and decarbonize its economies, right? That it would not be a good idea to allow other companies based in other countries to simply undermine, decarbonization policies in the European Union by simply exporting goods made with dirty technologies, and that therefore you need something like carbon border adjustments. What is a carbon border adjustment? It's a protectionist tool. You're putting up a tariff on an exporting country. But why are you doing that? You're doing that so you can protect, in a good way, your own domestic regulatory standards, your own your values, the value that you attach to slowing down climate change and speeding up the green transition. So that's a kind of a very vivid and I think well understood example of where if you cannot get agreement with your trade partners, you will have to do it and go it alone. And it'll look like you're actually engaged in trade restriction and protectionism. But that's the kind of protectionism that's good because it's protecting your own ability to uphold your own regulations and your own values. I think the kind of, the rules on supply chains that you were just talking about is very much of the same kind, that there's no way that, the United States and European countries will come to an agreement with China and many other countries on global minimum labor rights or human rights standards. I don't think that's likely, but that doesn't prevent from countries. I think France already has such a law. I take it that Germany is now discussing it. That if the political system, the nation as a whole, decides that we hold these human rights and labor rights as very important, and we don't want our corporations to employ workers under conditions that would violate internationally recognized labor rights and human rights. We're not going to allow them to do it, no matter where they are. So that's kind of extraterritoriality. I think it's also okay, because we don't want to be complicit in human rights violations that are in which, basically they are done essentially at our behest, because they are our suppliers. I think there are many other areas, and in fact here I'm a bit of a maybe dissenter on the global corporate minimum taxation idea, because there are some areas where in fact certain diversity may be okay. So if Singapore and the Ireland want to have low corporate taxes in their own jurisdictions because they believe in the value of low corporate taxation, it's not to essentially steal revenue from other companies. These are not tax havens in the way that, let's say, the Cayman Islands are. It's actually low corporate taxation that applies to real physical investment, as opposed to the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands, which is just pure tax havens. I'm not so sure that there is a good argument that we should basically prevent them, or we should force them to have higher corporate taxes because Europe and the Americans, or other Europeans and Americans, want to have higher corporate taxes. So there I see a bit of a trade-off. Now, if all countries can agree on a common minimum, fine. But I can certainly understand why Singapore, for example, is very uncomfortable in this discussion. And they say, well, in our jurisdiction, if we want to apply a different corporate tax rate, why should Siemens subsidiary in Singapore be subject to the same rules in Germany, even though they are essentially a Singaporean company. They're operating under my jurisdiction. They're a Singaporean company under law. So there is a bit more of a trade-off there that we need to think through. But to get back to your question, yes, I mean, the nation state is still very much alive, has significant powers.
Perhaps to come back to that idea, and you're overseeing Siemens Energy, of course, so the question of things like, carbon, CO2 taxation, etc., is very, very important. How do you see this point? So are there possibilities for Europe, say, for example, if they wanted to go ahead with a higher CO2 taxes to protect that that policy program, if you will, with a carbon border tax adjustment, or do you often have to wait until you have the full international agreement? How about this tension?
Well, I mean, the downside is if you wait for a global agreement, you may wait forever. And companies, they've got a job to do. They have more to lose than an election. So we can't really wait that long. So it would be extremely desirable if, for example, Europe came together and said, look, this is our agenda, how we are going to reduce emission in Europe. And everybody in the whole world is invited to participate. And that's the set of rules if you want to do business. In the second biggest economy in the world, if you bring all the 27 together. And so this is certainly something where you make a policy. You're open to anybody to participate, but is that in Europe, if you want to participate, this is the set of rules. And any CO2 per ton costs you 80 or 100 euro, on sort of taxes. And what you would do is you take that money and make, and invest it into innovation or into structurally challenged industries to help them the transition. That comes back to the social sort of flooring that you provide opportunities without taking the responsibility of people's backs for their future, which is this non-conditional income, which is stupid because you've got to do something for your own employability too. There's a responsibility. That's the type of stuff. So, for example, green hydrogen. Green hydrogen will never work by physics if you don't have a CO2 emission tax. But that's got to stay for longer than 3 or 4 years, because if you invest into something today, you've got to have some sort of certainty on your business case. So that's the most dangerous topic typically if you depend on governmental rules and regulations, because somebody comes in and says, do away with all environmental, that's only invented by the Chinese. And then 4 years later, somebody comes back and says, oh, by the way, now we are going to be back in Paris. Okay, fine. Then what happens in the next 4 years? Well, maybe we are back to, I don't know, oil and gas or hydrocarbons. So this is really complicated. So you ought to have an understanding that this is the way you want to pave. And that's why I was so, so positive about, the United States coming back to the Paris Agreement, and hopefully have the COP26 and find a meaningful acceleration actually by a joint understanding on areas how to tax emission. And then, you can do what you want. You pay a higher price for emission and continue to be old economy. So the government would take that money and apply it to new innovations and new business cases on green technology. And this is how a government accelerates and forces transformation by using its framework, to benefit the ones who are up for innovation and to sort of penalize the ones who say, oh, well, it's always done the same way. And then, on the SUVs, for example, in Germany, I would never prohibit people from, driving an SUV. I said, why not? Come on, do it. But instead of €1,000 taxes, you pay 5,000, and you take the 4,000 and help environmentally friendly technologies to come up to speed and provide a good opportunity. And if the 5 grand are not enough, in 2 years, it's 10,000. So you leave people the choice to participate, but their contribution to society would be those €10,000, which are being applied to environmentally friendly technologies. That's the type of redistribution by still giving people the choice. And this is the type of stuff I think we ought to go look at and say, hey, if you want to continue like that, this is the cost of doing business. And at some point in time, the cost of doing business goes so high that the customers will change their priorities and their preferences. And then maybe they, what, if it's 15,000 per SUV, maybe I do all electric. Mm-hmm. So you would influence customers' choices, but not forcing them, not say, as of tomorrow, you're supposed not to fly short distances anymore. Well, just make it extremely expensive and then let people choose. And take that money, you collect from the penalties and use it for environmentally friendly innovation or education or what have you. It's courageous. You may lose your job after 4 years as chancellor, but you do something good for society. Think about Schröder. I mean, he lost his job over the reforms, but that still, is one of the most relevant sources in Germany why we are still doing okay. As okay as we can. But we've got to have a second sort of reform now, which is structural in nature.
Excellent. I think, Dani, Joe Kaeser, we've had a very exciting discussion between a professor and a manager of a global company about what needs to change in order to tackle the challenges of globalizations. I learned a lot. I wish we could go on for a long time, but I think we've run out of time. So thank you very much.
Yes, and many thanks to you all. Danny has indicated that he has another meeting to leave, and we're very happy that you've been here talking about paradigms. 5 years ago, when we started the initiative, we put you on a picture with people who maybe in hindsight may be seen as the ones who have driven the new paradigm. So despite your piece of last week, I will keep this idea in mind. In hindsight, maybe people will say, well, we are talking about something which will be seen as the new paradigm, and Joe Kaeser at his function, and his function has contributed to that. I will leave you. Many thanks, Joe Kaeser. Many thanks, Nicola. Many thanks, Danny. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. We will talk about financial fraud, and very exciting with high-level people, Gerhard Schick, Martin Helwig, State Secretary, Cookies, We will continue with the climate debate, hugely amazing, challenging climate debate. And then in the afternoon, debate on the fiscal policy issues with high-level people, including Philippe Martin, the advisor of Macron, and others speaking about what we need as fiscal rules to affront all these challenges we've been talking about in this today, in this talk and in other sessions. So thank you again, and all people around, have a nice evening, and we'll be back at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you, and have a good evening, all of you.